My name is Frank Miller. I'm 68 years old, and I live in Dayton, Ohio. I've spent most of my life working with my hands, keeping my head down, and taking pride in things that don't glitter but last. I've never cared much about appearances. I always believed a man's worth showed in the way he carried himself, not in the shine of his shoes or the cost of his clothes. Lately, though, I've started to wonder if the world around me has forgotten that. Even the person closest to me seemed to lose sight of it, and that realization settled heavier on me than I expected. I grew up in a house where money was tight, but dignity was free. My father wasn't a fancy man, yet he walked with certainty. He taught me that confidence never needs to announce itself. I carried that lesson into adulthood, through every job I worked and every difficulty I faced. It shaped my marriage, too. For years, Linda said she loved my steadiness, my simplicity, and the way I never pretended to be anything I wasn't. But over time, I noticed small changes. They came softly, politely. A comment about my truck, a sigh when I wore the same jacket, a look at my shoes that felt different somehow. I tried to ignore those signs, telling myself I was reading too much into things. But deep down, I felt something shifting. I'm not a man who likes conflict. I don't go looking for trouble, and I don't speak just to fill the air. Still, there comes a point when a man has to face what's in front of him, whether he wants to or not. This story isn't dramatic, but it's true. And it begins with a moment I didn't see coming. Those shoes of mine. They weren't much to look at. Brown, scuffed, and softened by years of use. I bought them from a discount rack sometime in my 50s, back when money was tighter and priorities were clearer. They were never meant to impress anyone. They were simply meant to get me through the days, and they did that well. The soles molded to my feet, the leather thinned in the spots where I bent down to lift lumber or kneel in the garage. Every mark on them told a story, even if no one else cared to hear it. I've owned nicer things in my life, but those shoes were honest. That's what mattered to me. Honest things don't pretend. They don't show off. They just hold steady, the same way a good man tries to. A lot of folks these days don't understand the comfort in something worn in and reliable. But men my age do. We grew up fixing what we had, stretching every dollar, and keeping things going longer than anyone thought they would. Those shoes were part of that life. Linda used to smile when I slipped them on. Back when we were younger, she'd say, "Frank, you and those shoes are going to grow old together." It was playful, affectionate. She said it like she admired the fact that I didn't fuss about things that didn't matter. I held on to that memory for years. It reminded me that she once loved the grounded man I was, not for how I looked, but for how I lived. But the thing about life is that people change without announcing it. One season rolls into the next, and suddenly, the things that once brought you closer become the very things that push you apart. Somewhere along the way, those same shoes became a symbol of something else to her. Something she didn't say out loud, but showed in little glances. Disapproval, embarrassment, maybe even resentment. I didn't buy new shoes because I didn't need them. I didn't feel the urge to fix something that wasn't broken. But Linda started hinting, then nudging, then outright suggesting I should upgrade a little. I brushed it off. A man shouldn't have to explain why he's comfortable in his own skin or in his own shoes. Still, a part of me wondered if maybe she was feeling restless, or if she was trying to impress someone I didn't know about. Looking back, I realized the shoes were never really the problem. They were just the easiest thing for her to point at. But at the time, I didn't see the truth hiding underneath. I just saw my wife looking at something that had carried me through years of responsibility and effort, and acting like it wasn't good enough anymore. And that's a hard thing for any man to swallow. A marriage doesn't unravel all at once. It loosens in tiny threads. I started noticing the first one the day Linda stopped asking how my day was. It wasn't deliberate, just a quiet, slipping away of habit. Then came the afternoons when she'd stay out longer with her friends, claiming they lost track of time. I didn't pry. I didn't accuse. I've always believed trust is something you maintain by giving it. But even a trusting man can feel when the ground shifts under his feet. The shift wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some explosive argument or betrayal. It was more subtle than that. She'd correct me in front of people over things that didn't matter. She'd talk about me like I wasn't in the room, making little jokes that made others laugh but made me feel smaller. None of it was cruel, exactly. Just careless. A kind of carelessness that creeps in when someone stopped seeing you the way they once did. One night, after she got home from a dinner with her new group of friends, she tossed her bag on the counter and sighed in that way people do when they're annoyed but won't tell you why. I asked if everything was all right. She said, "Frank, you really should think about updating your wardrobe. The world's moved on. You don't have to look worn out all the time." Worn out. She said it casually, as if she were talking about an old chair, but it hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't angry, just surprised. I had never cared about looking modern or polished. My life wasn't built on those things. But hearing my wife say it, in that tone, made me realize something had shifted inside her. Something about me embarrassed her now. I didn't push the issue. I just nodded and went to bed earlier than usual. She stayed up scrolling on her phone, laughing at posts I couldn't see, joining conversations I wasn't part of. The glow from the screen lit up her face in the dark room, and for the first time, I felt like I was watching a stranger sitting beside me. The next few weeks followed the same pattern. Linda seemed impatient with the quiet rhythm of our life. She'd comment on other couples, how stylish they looked, how active they were, how they kept things fresh. It wasn't lost on me what she was implying. She wanted change, but she didn't want to say it directly. She wanted me to guess, to chase, to reinvent myself. At my age, a man knows when he's being measured against something he never agreed to compete with. I tried to bring up the distance I felt growing between us, but she brushed it off. Said I was overthinking, said everything was fine. But her tone, her eyes, her new habits, they all told a different story. I felt myself shrinking in my own home, not because I believed her friends were better than me, but because she seemed to believe they were. The moment that finally opened my eyes was small, but unforgettable. We were getting ready for a neighborhood gathering, and as I tied my shoes, my cheap, worn-in ones, Linda let out a soft, frustrated breath, the kind that isn't meant to be heard, but is. I looked up at her. She forced a smile. But the truth was already in the air between us. She didn't see my shoes as part of who I was anymore. She saw them as evidence of something lacking. A distance grew from that moment on, not from anger, but from understanding. I knew something fundamental had shifted. The woman who once admired my steadiness now saw it as stagnation. The shoes she once joked about were now a mark against me, and I realized if something didn't change, the quiet drift between us would only grow wider. I first noticed the real divide when Linda began spending more time with her new circle of friends. They were flashy women, always dressed to the nines, talking about vacations, handbags, and renovations like they were discussing the weather. I didn't fit into that world, and I didn't try to. Whenever I joined them, I felt like a piece of old furniture in a modern showroom. Useful, maybe, but out of place. Linda didn't seem to mind the contrast at first, but slowly, her eyes began to linger on the differences between us. I've never been the kind of man who needs attention. I'm comfortable in the background. But sitting with those women, listening to them brag about everything under the sun, I realized that I wasn't only a quiet presence, I was invisible. They talked around me, over me, sometimes through me, like I wasn't even there. And Linda, instead of noticing, seemed caught up in the glitter of their world. There was one moment that stuck with me. We were at a backyard gathering, and one of her friends, Janet, gave me a quick glance, then looked down at my shoes. They were clean, but worn. She whispered something to Linda, and they both laughed. Not loudly, but enough. Enough for me to know I was the topic. Linda didn't defend me or brush it off. She joined in. That laugh did something I didn't expect. It pinched at something inside me. Not pride, not ego, but something deeper. It made me feel like I didn't belong beside my own wife in the world she was drifting toward. I didn't say anything. I stood there with the same shoes I'd worn for years, and a growing sense that I was becoming a stranger in my own life. After that day, I noticed how often Linda talked about her friends, their homes, their husbands, their outings. Every story seemed to paint them as polished and impressive. Each one seemed to highlight, by comparison, what she thought I wasn't. Still, I stayed quiet. A man learns not to speak every thought that crosses his mind. But silence doesn't mean blindness, and I could see clearly that something was changing, even if she couldn't, or wouldn't, admit it. Linda didn't seem unhappy with me, not directly. She wasn't cold or angry. She seemed distracted, almost eager to impress these women whose approval wasn't worth much. They cared more about posting a moment than living it. I wasn't threatened by them. I was disappointed that Linda couldn't see how hollow that world was. One evening, after an outing, she told me about a new restaurant her friends liked. She said, "Frank, you should have seen it. Everyone looked so sharp." The way she said sharp made me pause. It wasn't just a description. It was an expectation. She wanted that from me, too. I nodded and listened, but inside, something shifted. I realized I wasn't losing my wife's affection. I was losing her admiration. And admiration, once gone, is hard to reclaim. Not because it can't be earned, but because the person who lost it stops looking for reasons to give it. These friends of hers weren't bad people, maybe, but they were the wrong people for her. The kind who saw value in brands instead of character. Sometimes people don't notice a cliff until they've stepped off. And Linda was stepping closer to that edge every day. Closer to a version of herself that didn't have room for the man I was. And I sensed that sooner or later, something was going to break. Linda brought up the dinner invitation on a Thursday evening, right after work, when the sun was low and the house was quiet. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen with a kind of bright excitement I hadn't seen in a long while. "Frank," she said, "Janet and the others want us to join them for dinner this Saturday. It's a nice place. I already told them we'd go." She said it like a decision, not a question, and that told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't being invited. I was being summoned. I looked at her, and something in her expression made my stomach tighten. She seemed hopeful, but not about spending time with me. It was as if she wanted to present me, polish me up, make me acceptable for her new world. I didn't argue. A man my age learns which battles aren't worth fighting. Still, the thought of sitting at a table with women who measured worth by fabric labels and vacation photos made me uneasy. Later that evening, Linda mentioned that the place had a dress code, then glanced at my clothes like she was conducting an appraisal. "Maybe wear something nicer," she said. "Something fresh." Fresh. The word hung in the air like a subtle insult. I didn't respond. I only nodded and went back to my newspaper, though the words on the page blurred. Saturday came faster than I wanted. I stood in front of my closet for longer than I'd ever admit, knowing full well that nothing in there would meet the unspoken standards Linda hoped I would rise to. I chose my cleanest shirt, my best jacket, and of course, my old shoes, the same ones Linda had been pretending not to see. When she saw me ready, Linda gave a tight smile. Not angry, not disappointed, just resigned, like she already knew what her friends would think. She didn't say a word about my clothes, but her silence said enough. The drive to the restaurant was quiet, except for the sound of turn signals and the soft hum of the engine. She looked out the window most of the way, and I kept my eyes on the road, feeling the distance between us deepen mile by mile. The closer we got, the heavier the air felt. The restaurant was one of those places where the lighting is dim, the napkins are folded like art pieces, and everyone's trying their hardest to appear wealthier than they really are. As we walked in, I noticed how the hosts looked us up and down, not rudely, but noticeably. I could almost see their assessment. She belongs, he doesn't. We found her friends already seated at a long table, all polished smiles and sparkling jewelry. Their greeting to Linda was warm, almost theatrical. Their greeting to me was polite, but distant, like I was an obligation rather than a guest. I sat beside Linda, feeling like I'd been placed there as a courtesy, not a choice. The conversation flowed around me, loud and fast. They talked about new cars, spa trips, overpriced boutiques, things that didn't matter in the world I knew. I contributed when I could, but each comment felt like dropping a stone into a rushing stream, instantly swallowed, unnoticed. And Linda. She wasn't cruel, but she didn't pull me into the conversation either. She stayed aligned with them, leaning in, laughing at their stories. A heaviness settled into my chest. I wasn't angry that they didn't value the things I did. I was hurt that Linda seemed to forget that those things once mattered to her too. As I listened to her talk, I realized this evening wasn't for me. It was for them, for her, for the image she wanted to maintain. But I went along with it because sometimes a man goes through the discomfort to understand what's really shifting beneath the surface. And something was definitely shifting. I could feel it like a cold draft under a closed door. Dinner hadn't even arrived yet, and already I knew. This night would show me something I wasn't ready to see. I sat quietly, watching everything with a feeling I couldn't. The moment that broke something inside me didn't come with shouting or drama. It came quietly, the way real wounds do. Dinner had finally arrived, and the table filled with plates that looked more like artwork than food. Everyone complimented each other's choices, each comment sounding rehearsed. I picked at my meal, not because it wasn't good, but because I felt like a visitor in someone else's world. Then it happened. Janet, the same woman who had whispered about my shoes before, leaned forward, looked down at my feet, and smirked. "Frank," she said loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "I see you've brought your classics." Her friends snickered, covering their mouths, pretending to be polite about their mockery. I could have handled their laughter. I've been teased before. I've had worse said to my face by men who meant it. But when I turned to Linda, expecting her to roll her eyes at them, or maybe tell them to cut it out, I saw something I never expected. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a confused one. She laughed like she'd been waiting for someone else to say it first. She leaned in, touched Janet's arm, and said, "Oh, you know, Frank, he can't let go of those old things. I've tried." I felt something inside me go still. The room didn't spin. My heartbeat didn't race. It was quieter than that. A kind of settling, the way dust falls after a collapse. I looked at her, and she looked everywhere except at me. The table kept laughing. Their jokes rolled on, harmless to them, painful to me. Linda's face stayed lit up, bright and social, as if nothing cold had just passed between us. I didn't say a word. A man doesn't need to speak when the truth is already loud. I cut my food slowly, forcing my hands to stay steady. I nodded when someone asked me a question. I even smiled once or twice. But inside, something small and important had cracked. Respect isn't a loud thing. It doesn't leave with a shout. It slips out the back quietly, the way Linda's had just done. The rest of the dinner blurred. I remember voices, music, clinking glasses, but I felt detached, like I was watching life through a window. Linda didn't notice. She kept glowing under the approval of people who wouldn't lend her a hand if she stumbled. When the check came, I reached for it. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I didn't want to owe them a thing. I signed my name, my hands calm, my face steady. Linda smiled at her friends as we stood up, hugging them goodbye like they were family. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. I held the door for her, and she walked ahead, still riding the high of their approval. I walked slowly behind her, my shoes tapping against the pavement. Old, cheap, worn, and absolutely mine, the drive home was silent, not tense, just empty. She didn't ask if something was wrong, and I didn't tell her. Sometimes silence is the only place a man can hold his wounded pride without dropping it. When we got home, she went straight to the bedroom to change out of her fancy clothes. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, looking down at my shoes, the same ones she had mocked by joining their laughter, the same ones that had carried me through decades of responsibility, mistakes, triumphs, and quiet sacrifices she never even knew about. I bent down, untied them slowly, and placed them by the door. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if they belonged in this house anymore, because I wasn't sure if I did. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, trying to steady myself. The house felt unfamiliar. I thought about the years Linda and I had shared. I wondered when admiration had faded. As I stood there, I realized the dinner wasn't the cause. It was the evidence. And once a truth like that shows itself, a man can't pretend. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The laughter from the restaurant kept replaying in my mind. Not theirs, but Linda's. It echoed in a place inside me I didn't know could still be hurt. A man can take a joke, but not when it comes from someone who once held his heart with both hands. The next morning, I moved slower than usual. Not out of anger, but out of a heaviness I couldn't shake. As I made my way to the closet to grab my work jacket, my eyes drifted upward to the top shelf. The place most people forget exists. There, behind an old blanket and a box of holiday lights, was a plain cardboard box I hadn't touched in years. It wasn't hidden, just stored, put away during a different chapter of my life when pride meant something quieter. I stood there for a moment, feeling a pull I hadn't felt in decades, like the past was calling out with something unfinished. I reached up and brought the box down. It felt lighter than I remembered. Dust clung to the corners, the kind that gathers when time moves faster than you realize. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, the box resting on my knees like an old truth waiting to be acknowledged. Linda walked by the doorway but didn't stop. She didn't ask what I was holding. Maybe she didn't notice. Maybe she didn't want to. Either way, it told me something. The distance wasn't just in my head. I rested my hand on the lid, feeling the worn cardboard beneath my palm. Inside that box was something she had long forgotten about. A piece of me I'd never shown off but had always kept close. Something that mattered. Something that reminded me of who I really was before life got busy and before admiration faded into criticism. I didn't open it yet. Some moments require stillness. Some truths need a breath before they're revealed. I sat there, letting things settle. The house was quiet, a quiet that sits heavy. I realized whatever was inside this box wasn't just an object. Maybe it was time to bring it back into the light. When I finally opened the box, I did it slowly, like a man lifting the lid on a memory he isn't sure he's ready to face. Inside, wrapped in the same tissue paper I'd used decades ago, was a pair of shoes unlike any I had ever worn to work. Italian leather, dark brown, polished, even after all the years they'd spent untouched. They were the one expensive thing I had ever bought for myself without hesitation. I remembered the day I purchased them. I had just been promoted to foreman, a moment that carried more pride than any award. I walked past a small shoe shop on Main Street and saw them in the window. Something about them called out to me, a reminder that even a man who worked with his hands could enjoy something fine. I walked in, tried them on, and bought them without a second thought. Linda had smiled when she saw them, back when admiration lived openly between us. But life has a way of redirecting celebrations. Before I ever had the chance to wear them, our youngest got sick. Medical bills grew faster than paychecks, and priorities shifted like continents. I tucked the shoes away, promising myself I'd wear them someday, maybe to an anniversary dinner or a family celebration. But someday never came. Not because I forgot, but because life doesn't leave much time for expensive shoes that don't match work. As I held them now, the weight pressed against me. They weren't just shoes. They were a version of myself I never took the time to step into. A man who allowed himself small luxuries, moments of pride, visible reminders that he had achieved something. A man Linda once believed in. I set them on the bed gently, the way you'd place a fragile truth. The leather felt cool under my fingers, untouched by the years. They looked brand new, untarnished. Unlike me. Linda walked by again, this time slowing just enough to glance at the shoes. Her eyes flickered, recognition passing through them like a shadow. "Those?" she asked, her voice soft but distant. "I forgot you still had them." Her tone wasn't cruel, but it wasn't warm either. It was the tone of someone seeing something that didn't fit the picture they'd been painting. The truth is, she had forgotten. She'd forgotten the man who bought them, the pride he once carried, the hopes he tucked away quietly so he could shoulder responsibilities without complaint. I didn't answer her. Instead, I lifted the shoes and placed them back inside the box, not to hide them, but to hold on to something she no longer seemed to recognize. Standing there, I realized the box held more than leather and stitching. It held a reminder that I hadn't always been the man she laughed at. I had been many things: strong, capable, ambitious. Somewhere, along the years, I had let those parts of myself slip beneath the surface, buried under routine and responsibility. But they weren't gone. They had simply been waiting. As I closed the box, a thought settled in my chest. Respect lost can be regained, but not by proving yourself to the wrong audience. Sometimes it takes remembering who you were before the world, or the person you love, convinces you that you're less. I placed the box back on the bed and breathed deeply, feeling something steady return to me. Maybe those shoes were never meant for celebration. Maybe they were meant for this moment, when I finally remembered my own worth. They reminded me of hope. They mattered more than she realized. Meaningful. Truly. I didn't open the box again right away. Instead, I set it carefully on the dresser and walked into the bathroom to splash water on my face. My reflection looked older than I remembered. Lined, tired, but not defeated. There's a difference. A beaten man lowers his eyes. A wounded man looks back at himself and takes stock. I was the second. When I stepped back into the bedroom, the box seemed to hold a quiet gravity, like it was waiting for me to deal with what it represented. Memories rose up. Long workdays, sacrifices made, choices I didn't regret, but sometimes wished someone had noticed. A man doesn't seek praise, but he does deserve acknowledgement, especially from the person he's walked beside for decades. I sat on the edge of the bed again and let my hand rest on the lid. I wasn't thinking about the shoes themselves. I was thinking about what it meant that Linda had forgotten them, and what it meant that I had too. I'd forgotten the part of myself that had ambition outside of practicality, the part that allowed small celebrations to matter. As those thoughts swirled, Linda appeared in the doorway. Her hair was damp from the shower, and she looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen in months. "Frank," she said quietly, "you're up early." Not an apology, not a question, just an observation. But the gentleness in her voice made me look up. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. It was the truth, but it carried more weight than the words alone suggested. She glanced at the box again. "I really had forgotten about those," she said. "You kept them all this time?" I nodded. "Some things are worth keeping." She hesitated, then took a small step into the room. "Why did you buy them?" Her tone wasn't mocking this time. It was curious, even cautious, like she knew the answer mattered more than she once realized. I took a slow breath. Because I was proud. Because I wanted one thing that wasn't about work or bills or responsibility. Something that felt like possibility. Linda lowered her eyes, and I could see a flicker of understanding. Or guilt. Maybe both. "Frank, about last night," she began, but I raised a hand gently. "Not now," I said. "There's a time to talk, and there's a time to think. I'm still thinking." She didn't argue. She just nodded, then walked away with a quiet that wasn't cold this time, just uncertain. After she left, I opened the box again. The shoes sat there like a testimony. I lifted one and held it, weighing years between who I was and who I became. A man doesn't lose himself all at once. He misplaces himself in small moments, choosing duty over desire, silence over confrontation, peace over self-respect. I'd done that more times than I could count, and little by little, I had stopped expecting to be admired. That was the real wound, deeper than the laugh at the restaurant. I set the shoe down and leaned back, letting memories settle like dust. Good years, hard years, quiet victories no one saw, sacrifices no one thanked me for. I realized something important. The shoes were never about wealth or impressing anyone. They were about recognizing my own worth before I forgot it. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the morning sun was rising over the neighborhood, casting a warm glow across the lawn. The world looked the same, but something inside me had shifted. Slowly, but unmistakably, I walked into the hallway, feeling each step with awareness. The house felt different, not because anything changed, but because I had. I paused by the dining table, where Linda and I had shared many moments. I wondered how many moments I'd let slip without speaking up. A man can go decades without asking for much, but even the strongest carry a ledger of respect. Mine had been unbalanced for too long. I knew the next steps wouldn't be about anger. They would be about restoring dignity I had allowed to fade. For the first time in a long while, I felt ready. Not loudly or dramatically, but steadily, with purpose. I turned back toward the bedroom, toward the box on the bed. The shoes were no longer a forgotten memory. They were a reminder that I wasn't done being the man I once hoped to be. And I felt something inside me settling, not resignation, but resolve. A quiet promise to myself that whatever came next wouldn't come from hurt, but from remembering who I was, and who I still could be. The day after the dinner felt different, though nothing noticeable had changed. The house sounded the same. The coffee brewed the same. The morning light fell across the kitchen floor the same way it always had. But inside me, something had shifted. When a man is humiliated publicly, especially by the person who should protect his dignity, something settles deep, like a stone dropped into water. I didn't slam doors or raise my voice. I didn't even sigh. I simply grew quiet, not out of bitterness, but out of a need to sit with what I was feeling. A younger man might yell or slam his fist on the table, but with age comes a different kind of anger, calmer, heavier, more thoughtful. It doesn't flare, it sinks. Linda noticed the quiet immediately. She kept glancing at me over her coffee mug, waiting for me to start a conversation, to ask about her plans, to fill the silence the way I usually did. But I didn't. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the ripples swirl, feeling the weight of everything unspoken resting between us. At one point, she tried to make small talk. "Did you sleep all right?" she asked softly. "Well enough," I said, though we both knew I hadn't. She nodded like she understood, but I could see uncertainty in her eyes. She couldn't decide whether to pretend the night before hadn't happened or bring it up directly, but she didn't apologize. Not then, not yet. Instead, she sat quietly, drumming her fingers on the table the way she does when she's uncomfortable. Normally, I'd rescue her from that discomfort with a joke or a change of subject. But not today. Today, the silence wasn't a gap to fill. It was a boundary, a line she had crossed without realizing it, and one I now needed to redraw. The odd thing about silence is that it scares the guilty more than anger ever does. Linda wasn't used to me being quiet. Not like this. She kept stealing glances, waiting for me to say something sharp or sarcastic, but I didn't have any of that in me. I wasn't interested in lashing out. What I felt wasn't rage. It was disappointment, deep, steady, undeniable. Later in the morning, as I washed up the dishes, she hovered near the kitchen doorway. "About last night," she began, her voice thin. "I didn't mean—" I held up a hand, not harshly but firmly. "Not right now," I said. She blinked, surprised. I'd never stopped her from talking before, but some conversations can't begin until a man gathers himself. And some apologies aren't ready to be heard until the person offering them understands the depth of what they've done. She nodded and stepped back, giving me space. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something rare: control. Not domination, not stubbornness, just a quiet reclaiming of my own dignity. The silence wasn't punishment. It was clarity. And clarity, I realized, was exactly what needed to come next. I woke before sunrise the next morning. Not because I'd rested well, but because my mind wouldn't stay still. The box with the shoes sat on the dresser, angled slightly as if it were watching me. I hadn't planned to confront Linda. Confrontation wasn't in my nature. But silence alone couldn't carry the weight of what needed to be said. Not this time. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, letting the warmth soak into my hands. I heard Linda's footsteps upstairs, slow and uncertain. Normally she moved with confidence, but this morning she hesitated, as if unsure whether she was welcome in her own home. That, more than anything, told me she understood the line she had crossed. When she came downstairs, she paused in the doorway, taking me in with a searching look. "Frank," she said softly, "are you all right?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I nodded toward the kitchen table, inviting her to sit. She did, folding her hands in her lap like a student waiting for a difficult lesson. I could see she wanted to speak first, but I raised a hand gently. "Before you say anything," I began, "I need you to listen." She nodded quickly, her eyes fixed on mine. "I'm not angry because your friends laughed at me," I said. "I've been laughed at before, and I'll be laughed at again. What hurt was that you joined them. You didn't defend me. You didn't stand with me. You stood with them." Her shoulders sagged, as if she'd been bracing for those words. "Frank, I didn't mean, this isn't about meaning," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It's about respect. You forgot who I am. You forgot what I've done for this family. You looked at me like I was something to be embarrassed by." Linda swallowed hard, but she didn't interrupt again. I reached over to the counter and picked up the box. I set it between us. She looked at it like it was a stranger in the room. "Open it," I said. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. When she saw the shoes, her breath caught. She touched the leather gently, tracing the lines as if trying to remember something long forgotten. "Frank, I didn't know you still had these." "You didn't ask," I replied quietly. "You stopped seeing the parts of me that weren't convenient to your new world, and because of that, you forgot who I was before life got busy." She looked up at me, eyes shining with something between remorse and realization. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "I know," I said. "But you did." For a long moment, we sat in heavy silence. Not the cold silence from the night before. This was different. This silence had truth in it. Weight, purpose. Finally, I continued. "I'm not asking you to apologize with words. I'm asking you to remember. Remember the man I've been all these years. The man you married. The man who didn't need fancy things or other people's approval." She nodded slowly. "I have forgotten," she admitted. "I didn't mean to, but I did. That's why this box is on the table," I said. "Not to shame you, to remind you." Linda reached across the table and rested her hand on mine. We'd shared that gesture thousands of times, but this one felt different, older, heavier, needed. "I don't want to lose the man you are," she said quietly. I took a breath, feeling the weight in my chest ease slightly. "Then don't," I answered. "But understand, respect isn't something you give once. It's something you keep choosing." She nodded again, slower this time, as if the truth was settling into her. "Tell me what you need, Frank," she whispered. "For you to stand with me," I said simply. "Not beside your friends, not beside trends. With me." She looked down at the shoes again, then back at me with a steadiness I hadn't seen in a long time. "I can do that," she said. I believed her, and I needed that promise more than she realized that day. I didn't expect the conversation at the kitchen table to fix everything, and it didn't. What it did was clear the fog that had been building between us. But clarity is only the first step. The harder part comes afterward, when two people must decide what they're going to do with the truth laid out in front of them. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Linda moved through the house with a carefulness I wasn't used to seeing from her. She watched me the way someone watches a fragile object they're afraid to bump. But I wasn't fragile. I was simply done pretending nothing had happened. Around noon, she found me out back, sitting in the small shed I'd built years ago. It was my place to think, my place to breathe when life pressed too hard. She stepped in slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. "Frank," she said softly, "can we talk now?" I nodded. She sat on the old stool across from me, the one with paint stains from a dozen projects I'd repaired over the years. For a long moment, she didn't speak. She just looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since our early marriage, an expression that said she was truly seeing me. "I was wrong," she finally said. "I'm not making excuses. I just lost track of what mattered. Somewhere along the line, I started worrying more about how people saw us than how we felt together." Her honesty wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was steady, the way truth ought to be. "I know," I said quietly. "I saw it happening." She closed her eyes briefly. "When they laughed at your shoes, I should have told them to stop. I should have stood up for you. I don't even know why I didn't." "You wanted to fit in," I replied. "You wanted their approval." "Yes," she whispered, "and I hate that you saw that in me." I leaned back on the workbench, letting her words settle in the air. "You forgot who I am," I said. "But I forgot something too. I forgot to remind you. I forgot to expect respect. I let things slide because it was easier than speaking up." She shook her head. "You shouldn't have had to remind me." "But that's marriage," I said. "Sometimes we teach each other how to treat us, and sometimes we teach the wrong lesson." A silence followed, not empty, but thoughtful. Linda looked around the shed, her eyes tracing the shelves I built, the tools I'd kept running, the projects I'd repaired for neighbors, for family, for her. "I don't know how I lost sight of all this," she said softly. "You didn't lose sight of it," I said. "You stopped looking." She took the words without argument. Then she asked something unexpected. "Frank, do you still love me?" The question hit deeper than I expected, not because I doubted my answer, but because she needed to ask it. "I do," I said, "but love needs respect to stand on. Last night shook that." She nodded, tears gathering but not falling. "I want to earn it back." For the first time that day, I felt something in me loosen, not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of it. "Then we start with honesty," I said, "and effort, and remembering who we were before all this noise got in the way." She reached out and placed her hand over mine. Her grip was gentle but steady. "We can start there," she said. We sat like that for a while, saying nothing. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed, but everything felt different between us. Raw, real, exposed. Later that afternoon, I brought the box with the shoes back out to the kitchen table. I placed it there not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Linda approached quietly. "Can I see them again?" she asked. I nodded, lifting the lid. She held one shoe in her hands, the same way she once held it the day I brought them home, But this time, her expression wasn't admiration or delight. It was reverence, understanding. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "They were meant for a celebration," I said. "One that never came." She looked at me slowly. "Maybe it still can." Her words weren't a promise. They weren't an apology. They were an offering, a small bridge extended between us. I took the shoe from her hands and set it back gently. "I'm not looking for celebration," I said. "I'm looking for partnership." "You have that," she replied, "and I'm going to show you." The resolve in her voice was quiet, like mine. Linda stepped outside and sat beside me later that evening. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching across the yard. She didn't force conversation. She simply sat beside me. "I've been thinking," she said. "So have I. I want to do better," she whispered. "For us." I nodded. "Then we take it one day at a time." She exhaled, a soft, relieved sound. "One day at a time." The night settled around us, and I felt peace returning. Sitting there with the woman I still loved, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Hope, truly. The morning after our talk in the shed, I woke with a clearer mind than I'd had in months. Not happy, not energized, just clear. Sometimes clarity arrives like a sunrise, slow, steady, inevitable. I lay there for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the faint sounds of Linda moving around the kitchen. She wasn't humming this time, but she wasn't moving with the sharp, hurried steps I'd grown used to. There was a gentleness again, the beginning of something familiar. I got up and dressed slowly, taking my time with each button, each motion. A man my age doesn't rush into a new chapter. He steps into it with care. When I walked into the kitchen, Linda turned from the counter and gave me a small, uncertain smile. Not forced, not decorative, a real one. "Good morning," she said quietly. "Morning," I replied. We moved around each other carefully, like two people who had once danced well together but were relearning the steps. She handed me a mug of coffee without asking how I wanted it. She remembered. That mattered more than I let on. We sat at the same table where everything had shifted the day before, the same table where the box had sat between us like a mirror. Today the box was gone, back in the bedroom, waiting, but the conversation it sparked hadn't faded. After a few minutes of quiet, Linda spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," she began, "about respect." I took a sip of coffee, letting her continue. "I didn't realize how far I'd drifted," she said. "How much pressure I let myself feel to keep up with people who don't actually matter to me." "I noticed," I said gently. "I know you did," she replied. "And I'm sorry I didn't notice it myself." Her voice didn't tremble. She wasn't trying to perform remorse. She was simply telling the truth. Something we hadn't done well in a long while. I nodded slowly. "We all lose sight sometimes." She looked down at her hands. "I don't want to be that woman, Frank. Not the one who laughs at her husband. Not the one who forgets who she married." The honesty tightened something in my chest. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Older men know the value of quiet. Words need room to settle. After a moment, I said, "I believe you, but rebuilding respect, it's not instant." She nodded. "I know. I'm willing to work at it." We finished our coffee without rushing. It was one of the first peaceful mornings we'd shared in months. But something else was simmering in me. An idea, a small one, but solid. A plan, though I wouldn't have called it that yet. Later that morning, when Linda went upstairs to sort laundry, I walked into the bedroom. The box sat neatly on the dresser, the lid closed. I opened it again, running my fingers over the polished leather, tracing the edges of the shoes that had somehow become the symbol of everything unsaid in our marriage. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to shame her. But I knew something quietly powerful. Sometimes the best way to restore respect is not through argument, but through action. Not loud action, not theatrical. Just a steady reminder of who a man is and who he has always been. I placed the shoes back in the box, closed the lid, and stood there thinking. The shoes weren't meant for a restaurant full of strangers. Not anymore. They were meant for a moment that carried weight, something between the past and the future. Linda walked into the room and paused when she saw me standing there. "Thinking about wearing them?" she asked softly. "Not yet," I said. "But soon." She stepped closer. "Whenever you do, I'd like to be there." That surprised me more than I let show. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't guilt. It was a request to witness, to share, to understand. "We'll see," I said gently. She nodded. No pressure, no push, just acceptance. The rest of the day unfolded simply. We cleaned the house together. We fixed a loose cabinet door. We ate lunch without the cold distance that had grown between us. Just ordinary tasks, but done together. Quiet teamwork, the way marriage is supposed to move. That night, when we sat on the couch to watch the news, Linda sat close, not out of obligation, but out of intention. Her hand brushed mine, hesitant at first, then steady when I didn't pull away. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the start of something, not new, but renewed. And in the back of my mind, the plan continued forming, slow and steady, shaped by something more powerful than anger, dignity, restoration, a reminder of who I was and who I still intended to be. The next morning, I woke up before Linda. The house was wrapped in that early quiet that belongs only to people who rise with the sun. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, feeling the weight of the shoes in the box across the room without even touching them. A man knows when a decision is forming inside him. Slow but sure, like a knot tightening. I went downstairs, brewed a pot of coffee, and stepped onto the back porch. The chill in the air reminded me of early mornings from years ago, when the kids were small and Linda would come out with a blanket around her shoulders, leaning into me as the sun came up. Those moments seemed far away now, but not lost. Just dusty. I sipped my coffee and let the morning settle. I felt calm, but not idle. Something in me had shifted. Not anger, not pride. Something steadier. Resolve. By the time Linda came downstairs, I had already decided what I needed to do. She stepped onto the porch wearing a sweater and an expression I couldn't quite read, part cautious, part hopeful. "You're up early again," she said softly. "Couldn't sleep," I answered. She sat beside me, folding her hands together. For a minute, we didn't talk. We just listened to the quiet neighborhood, the birds starting their morning songs, the wind brushing through the trees. Finally, she spoke. "I've been thinking a lot these last couple of days." "So have I." She took a breath. "I want to make things right, Frank. I don't want you to feel small in your own home, or anywhere." Her voice wasn't rushed or shaky. It was controlled, honest. The kind of voice a woman uses when she knows she stepped somewhere she shouldn't have. "I appreciate that," I said. "But it's not just about making things right. It's about changing something." She looked at me, waiting for more. I continued. "Respect isn't repaired with apologies alone. It's repaired with actions." She nodded slowly. "I understand." But I wasn't sure she did, not fully, not yet, so I spoke more plainly. "Yesterday in the shed, you asked me if I still loved you. I said yes, and I meant it. But love alone doesn't carry a marriage. Respect does. And I need you to see me again. Not the version you think others expect. Me. Linda's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. That mattered. I do see you, she whispered. I think I just forgot how much strength you carry quietly. I let her words settle between us. After a moment, she asked, What do you need from me, Frank? It was a simple question, but something inside me tightened. Because the truth was, I didn't need anything from her at that moment. I needed something from myself. Before I tell you that, I said, there's something I need to do first. She straightened slightly. What do you mean? I finished my coffee, set the mug down, and looked out across the yard. I mean, I need to remember who I am, not who I've become out of habit or routine, the man I used to be, the one who bought those shoes, the one who believed in his own accomplishments. Linda looked down, then back up at me with a careful, tender expression. How do you plan to do that? By taking a day for myself, I said. Not to run errands, not to fix things, not to sit around the house. A real day. For me. She blinked, surprised. I hadn't taken a day purely for myself in years, maybe decades. I'd taken days off for family emergencies, for appointments, for work transitions, but never to reconnect with myself. Of course, she said softly. Take whatever time you need. I nodded, but didn't speak further. The plan wasn't fully formed yet, but the foundation was there. And I knew one thing with certainty. The shoes would be part of it. After a few minutes of quiet, Linda stood and touched my shoulder gently. I'll give you space, she said. But I hope you'll let me walk beside you again when you're ready. I didn't answer right away. I just nodded, not out of uncertainty, but out of carefulness. A man doesn't rush something important. When she went back inside, I stayed on the porch, letting the morning light warm my face. That's when the idea settled. Not loud, not sudden, but clear. I would take those shoes out of the box. I would polish them. I would wear them for the first time in my life. Not for Linda, not for her friends, not for approval. For me. For the man who earned them all those years ago. For the man who had slipped out of sight under the weight of work, responsibility, and routine. I wanted to walk in them, not to a restaurant, not to a gathering, but somewhere meaningful. Somewhere that reminded me of what I'd accomplished before life grew complicated. The factory, the old one I'd worked in for decades, the place where I earned my promotions, my respect, my name stitched into the fabric of every project that came through those doors. It had closed years ago, but the building still stood, silent, empty, waiting. That's where I would go. A man's history matters. His beginnings matter. And sometimes, the only way to reclaim your dignity is to walk back through the place where it was born, in the shoes that symbolized everything you once were, and everything you're ready to become again. The following morning arrived with a gray sky and a soft drizzle tapping against the windows. It wasn't the kind of day most people would choose for anything meaningful, but I've always believed important moments don't wait for good weather. They arrive when they're meant to, and you meet them as you are. I stood in the bedroom, staring at the open box on the dresser. The shoes looked almost out of place in a world that had moved on without them. Their polished surface reflected the muted light from the window, a reminder of a version of me I hadn't seen in years. I reached out and lifted one, feeling the weight of it. Solid, steady, exactly how I used to feel. Linda appeared in the doorway. She didn't say anything at first. She just watched me, her expression gentle, not intrusive, not questioning. After a moment, she spoke softly. Are you going today? Yes, I said. I am. She nodded once, slowly. Do you need anything before you go? No, I said. Just time. She respected that. She stepped aside as I sat on the edge of the bed and began the slow process of putting on the shoes, truly putting them on for the first time. It felt almost ceremonial. I laced them carefully, pulling the leather snug around my foot. When I stood, they felt unfamiliar and familiar at the same time, like shaking hands with a man I used to know. Linda watched silently. There was no tension in her gaze, not anymore, just quiet understanding. You look good, she said. I didn't dress up otherwise, just my usual clothes, clean, simple, comfortable. The shoes didn't need an outfit to match them. They needed a purpose. I'll be back later, I said. Take your time, she replied. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The drizzle had faded to a light mist, the kind that hangs in the air instead of falling. I walked to my truck, opened the door, and paused for a moment before climbing inside. I rested my hands on the steering wheel, breathing in deeply. Then I turned the key. The drive to the old factory wasn't long, but it carried years with it. Memories of early mornings, long shifts, tired muscles, jokes shared during breaks, and pride that came from doing something well. Pride a man doesn't brag about but carries quietly. When I reached the building, I parked across the street. The factory looked older, weathered, but still standing. The red brick was faded, and the windows were dusty, but the structure remained. It felt like seeing an old friend after years apart. I stepped out of the truck and stood for a moment, letting the memory of the place settle around me. The air smelled like wet asphalt and distant echoes. I took a slow breath, feeling the solid ground beneath the new old shoes. Then I walked. Each step felt heavier than normal, but in a grounding way. The shoes creaked softly, adjusting to movement they'd waited years for. As I crossed the street, my reflection appeared briefly in a puddle, older, lined, but firm. A man reclaiming something. I approached the building, running my hand along the rough brick. This was where I had earned my life, where I had built the foundation of the home Linda and I shared, the family we raised, the reputation I carried. I walked the perimeter slowly, remembering the loading dock where I first shook my supervisor's hand. The break room window where steam from cheap coffee used to fog the glass. The side entrance where I stood the day I got promoted, holding pride in my chest like a warm coal. I paused near the tall metal doors at the front, the ones that once opened to the hum of machines and the chatter of workers. They were locked now, rust forming along the edges, but to me, the entire place still felt alive, silent, but not gone. I stood in front of the doors, letting my hand rest against the cool metal. This is who I was, I whispered. Who I am. The memory of my younger self stood beside me. Stronger in body, maybe, but not in resolve. A man who worked long hours without complaint, who carried his pride quietly, who didn't need expensive things to know his worth. I stepped back and looked down at the shoes. They looked right here, not in a restaurant full of strangers, not under the judgment of people chasing their own reflections, but on the ground where my dignity had been forged. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stood there, letting the past and present meet. Eventually, I walked along the side of the building, toward a bench near the old parking lot. It was rusted and weathered, but sturdy. I sat down and felt the shoes plant firmly against the ground. In that moment, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't come here to relive the past. I came here to remember that my worth wasn't defined by anyone else. Not Linda, not her friends, not society. It was defined by the years I showed up, the years I provided, the years I endured, the years I stood tall even when life pushed hard. The shoes didn't symbolize luxury. They symbolized earned ground. They symbolized the man who bought them, the man who still existed. And sitting there, with the factory standing guard and the mist settling around me, I felt something return to me. Strength. Not loud, not flashy, just steady. I stayed for a while, letting the moment settle deep inside. When I finally stood to leave, the shoes felt lighter, as if they had finally fulfilled their purpose. Back in the truck, I didn't rush home. I drove slowly, letting the road unwind beneath me. And with every mile, I felt more sure of myself, more sure of who I was, more ready for what came next. Driving back from the old factory felt different than I expected. I thought I'd feel nostalgic, maybe sentimental. Instead, I felt steady, rooted, the way a man feels after standing on ground that once carried the weight of his younger self. The road home stretched out ahead of me, familiar, but somehow new. Sometimes it isn't the road that changes. Sometimes it's the man who returns to it. When I turned onto our street, the drizzle had settled into a soft, misty grayness. The kind of weather that makes everything look gentler, quieter. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment, I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the leather of the shoes press firmly against the floorboard. A small reminder. I had taken a step back into my own dignity, and now I had to bring that man home. Linda must have heard the truck, because she opened the front door and stepped outside. She didn't rush toward me. She didn't wave. She just stood there with her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater, waiting. Her expression wasn't anxious or apologetic. It was something far more meaningful. Respectful. I climbed out of the truck, shut the door, and walked toward her. She noticed the shoes first. Her eyes softened, and she took a small breath, like seeing them meant something to her she hadn't fully understood before. "You wore them," she said quietly. "I did." "How did it feel?" "Right," I answered, "like something I should have done years ago." She nodded slowly, as if taking in the weight of the moment. Did going there help? "It reminded me of who I am," I said, "who I've always been." She stepped aside so I could walk in, but she didn't move far. It felt intentional, an invitation without pressure. Inside, the house smelled like stew simmering on the stove. Warm, familiar, comforting. The kind of smell that belongs to a home, not a show. "I made lunch," she said, "if you're hungry." "Thank you," I replied. We walked into the kitchen together. Linda moved differently today. Slower, more present, not performing, not trying to impress, just being here. As she ladled the stew into bowls, she glanced at me. "Frank," she said gently, "I want to understand what today meant to you." I sat at the table before answering. It meant remembering I don't need anyone else to tell me my worth. I've earned it, year after year, day after day. I paused, letting the truth settle. But I also needed to know you still see it. Her eyes filled, not with tears of guilt, but with something truer. Recognition. "I do see it," she whispered, "and I'm ashamed I let anyone make me forget." I nodded. We both forgot a few things. She set the bowls down, then sat across from me. Something in her posture had changed. Her shoulders weren't tight. Her chin wasn't lifted defensively. She looked like the woman I married decades ago, the one who valued character more than status, sincerity more than surface. I want to do better, she said, not to make up for one mistake, but because I've been drifting from who I used to be too. I appreciated the honesty. She wasn't blaming her friends. She wasn't blaming circumstances. She wasn't hiding behind excuses. She was owning it. That's all I want, I said, for both of us to do better. She reached across the table, not urgently, not dramatically, and rested her hand on mine, a simple gesture, a sincere one. What happens next? She asked softly. I looked at her, then down at the shoes on my feet. What happens next, I said, is we remember who we used to be, and we choose that again. Linda nodded slowly, deeply. I can do that. So can I. We ate in silence after that. Not awkward silence, but peaceful silence. The kind that fills the spaces between two people reconnecting after drifting too far apart. The kind that says, we're not fixed yet, but we're fixing. When we finished eating, Linda stood and walked around the table. She placed her hand gently on my shoulder and said, "You came home different today." I looked up at her. I came home as myself. And she smiled. The kind of smile a man can build a future on. And that was the end of the story. I really want to know what you thought. Did the ending hit you the way it hit me? Did Frank do the right thing? Did Linda deserve that moment of grace? Be honest. I can take it. If the story moved you, made you think, or even made you tear up a little, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Most important, drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me your favorite part, what you would have done differently, or how it made you feel. I read every single comment and I reply to as many as I can. Thank you for watching till the end. It means the world. See you in the next one.